Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
So thank you, Ed. We'd like to ask Josh now to come back on camera to answer some questions from our viewers. If you're just tuning in, please feel free to ask questions of our two panelists using the Q&A form on the screen. There's quite a few questions coming in, so please don't hesitate. I know that Josh and Ed are both interested in what you all want to talk about. So I'm going to get started by just clarifying a little bit for those of us who haven't studied these respective fields. I know that some say that the brain and the mind divide can be kind of understood as one of a divide between, say, hardware and software. I would love to know if you think that's a fair comparison. Is that apt? Where does it fall short?
I think we probably each have a perspective on that. I would say, there's something clearly compelling about it, in the sense that we know you can approach the mind as a mind and the brain as a brain. And you saw this in these two different talks, right? Which, Ed and I were both in the same department, but we take very different approaches to in many ways, the same kind of broad questions of like, what is this thing inside our skulls that makes us human? And we know that, for example, for millennia, really, going back as long as there's been any language and culture, at least, and probably much longer than that, and not just in humans, we have this ability in our mind to understand other minds, right? I talked a little about this, what we call intuitive psychology. So in some sense, we know there's a way to understand and predict other people's behaviors, not with the kind of high precision and certainly the spatial temporal precision that Ed is striving at there. But we know that even just intuitively, minds can build models of minds. And well before we had any idea of how the brain worked, even young children have some idea of how a mind works, right? And now in cognitive science, we've started to make much more precise computational models of that. And then in some sense, another way we know that that's this sort of a software level of distinction, or software level of analysis as distinct from the hardware level, is that when we try to take insights that we've learned and transfer them over into AI, whether it's robots or disembodied computers, there's a lot of things that we can transfer over, yet none of the actual hardware is shared, right? At the same time, right, there's distinctive features of the brain as a piece of hardware that the only way to understand them is to approach it biologically. And I think most neuroscientists and cognitive scientists too would say, well, the way we're used to thinking of the software and hardware divide on the engineering side, it doesn't really map over. It's not exactly that kind of divide, right? Because the whole thing evolves as one entity. It's not like it wasn't designed in a way that factorizes those two disciplines as they usually are in engineering. So to me, at least, that leaves us with another mystery, another really open challenge, which is how do we understand the different levels of analysis in the mind and brain that are somehow analogous in some ways, in part, to software and hardware, as well as understanding what might be unique to biology so far, a different, more integrated approach.
Ed, would you add to that, contribute to that?
Yeah. Thanks, Josh. That was a really, really eloquent way of putting it. Maybe just add a little bit of a perspective from the molecular neuroscience side. So, of course, computers and software were invented by humans. And so, there's this idea of abstraction layers, right? Where you can write a lot of high-level code without having to manipulate individual zeros or ones or individual electrons. But of course, the brain itself, not being human designed, having been evolved, is, we have to figure out whether that's the case, right? Where are the abstraction layers? And there's a
I say we have to figure out where. We know it's the case in some form. Or we could debate about that, but yes.
Yeah, but there are examples, I think, where molecular neuroscientists have found molecular mechanisms that we don't fully understand what they do. So for example, over the last 20 years, people have been studying how brain cells make cannabinoids, molecules that act a bit like the active ingredient in marijuana, or they make gases like nitric oxide that diffuse around. And what is the role that these molecules are playing? Are they serving specific computational roles? Are they doing other things? And the honest answer is, for many of these molecular pathways, we don't know. So of course, our ultimate goal is to understand the brain with a layer abstraction. So you don't have to chase every darned molecule in every single cell, which would be an intractable problem. But where does a specific mechanism fall along this gradient? Many cases, we don't know.
Yeah, and then that's a great example also because it shows us how the notion of the hardware level isn't just a network level, right? But it's that chemical level as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, and some of them are for one of you or the other, but I think in either case, please feel free to respond to one another's questions. So we've got a question that I think is a good follow-on for you, Ed. How far are we at this point from brain-to-brain communication?
Well, you could argue we're doing that right now.
Yeah, that's what I mean by abstraction layer.
Yeah. I guess the big question about, I think what the questioner is probably referring to are these attempts by people now to record directly from brain activity and then to induce in somebody else directly brain activity. And you could argue there's sort of a hardware and software problem there too. On the hardware side, how can you build a safe brain interface that has the right spatial and temporal precision to read and write to single neurons? And that is still an unsolved problem. Nobody solved the long-term brain interfacing problem. If you try to record from a single brain cell, eventually those pieces of hardware break down, and nobody quite understands fully why, although many people, including faculty at MIT, are working on ways to make electrodes that are more safe and that can last longer. And then there's a software side, right? Suppose you get a bunch of electrical pulses from one part of the brain. What do they mean? And one thing we're learning is that a lot of the things in neuroscience that we kind of took for granted 50 years ago, like, oh, this part of the brain does vision, or this part of the brain does audition or whatnot. The brain isn't so modular. Scientists at MIT, for example, found that visual system neurons can receive all sorts of information that relate to emotions. Who would have thought that, right? And so the breakdown in sort of the modularity of the brain, well, maybe it's still modular, but just with a finer granular scale, might mean that the subtleties of brain computation will require more investigation until a really good brain-to-brain interface will be feasible.
Yeah. Josh, you shared, you took us through a couple of images or videos around the development of a child's brain and talked about how AI development, we are trying to kind of map it on or mimic the development of a child's brain. So a question came in, how do we avoid, if we take that sort of that idea forward, how do we avoid things that can clearly occur in some people's brains, like say sociopathic AI thinking? How do we ensure that development is always in a positive direction, or is there a way to sort of channel the development in positive directions?
You mean in machines that we build that might be trying to learn, like, yeah. No, I mean, that's a great question, and it has several different thoughts and questions that you can unpack from it, right? Because I think, also in the spirit of what Ed was talking about, doing the science of the mind and brain in this reverse engineering way that we try to do, both of us in our different ways, maybe software and hardware levels, where we're trying to understand the brain like an engineer, right? That can lead to many different kinds of applications, including more powerful forms of machine intelligence, as well as ways of treating things that can go wrong in normal life development. So it's of interest to try to understand that kind of that behavior, both in normal humans or how the biological brain can go, as well as thinking about that from our machine perspective. And I would say that's a tough question, but actually some people in our group and with a number of colleagues think about this. And we do this partly by thinking about, from a reverse engineering toolkit, these ideas like emotion and moral reasoning. So for example, in Rebecca Sachs's lab at MIT, they study the computational, cognitive, and neural basis of how we understand our own and others' emotions. And we work with them to build computational models using some of the same tools. And it's actually really, really cool, some of the progress that's happened there. Another area that people work on is moral cognition, where we try to take people's intuitions about what is the right thing to do or what is not allowed, what can't you do, and try to understand in computational reverse engineering terms how those work. That's especially interesting because a lot of sometimes in ways we're probably all aware of, we teach kids, we tell them that's not allowed, that's the rules, that isn't the rules. But so much of our moral sense is actually not taught explicitly, just like, say, when we learn the rules of language, right? Most of that is not taught explicitly to a baby, giving them a lecture on grammar. And there's so many just intuitions we have about what is permissible or what is rude or what is just, not just rude, but like really, really not okay, bordering on sociopathy, right? And so, we're trying to understand and capture using actually these tools of probabilistic programs where you have to start off with a computational theory of mind. What is a goal? What is an intention? And how do you set your own goals and intentions so that they take into account other people's interests? And a theory that we and others explore is that some kind of basic appreciation for not only your own utilities, but other people's utilities is built in. And that's in a sense, it's like the computational version of the golden rule, which many cultures have something like that as a basic moral principle. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. You can write that down with a kind of recursive utility function. Take somebody else's expected utility as a component of your own expected utility. And that allows us to capture some of these basic ideas, including even in kind of moral intuitions you can see in 10-month-old babies. That's another collaboration we've done. So to putting that back to the AI side, the short story is put something like that into the hardware and hardwire it in and don't let it be changeable like a lot of the other code. When we were talking about machines that can learn to write and rewrite their own code, the idea that there might be some hard-coded, let's say, utility calculus that has to respect other people, that's one hypothesis for what's built into every normal brain that makes us not sociopaths. And then maybe something like that could break. Again, Ed's going to have to make a lot more progress, not just us, before we're able to understand how something like that might actually
work. It sounds like he just passed that off to you, Ed.
Yeah, well, so Josh already mentioned Rebecca's beautiful work where, they've used brain imaging and brain stimulation with human subjects and be able to look at and even change, how people think about ethics. And one of the things that our group has recently started to work on is whether you could build better non-invasive strategies for stimulating the brain for studying these kinds of things in humans, because it's very hard to study these in small animals, things like justice and ethics, although some people are thinking about that. So I think one of the other challenges, of course, is sometimes the decision's not clear. I mean, these famous questions like the trolley problem, right, where do you do this one thing or do the other thing, and there's always a cost. How do you weigh the balance there? And so I'm not an expert in this area, but I think one of the big questions is also, are there assumptions that our brains make that kind of underlie how our brains do these calculations?
Yeah, no, the trolley problem is a great example where we've, this is like the famous dilemma, like if there's a trolley going down a track that is going to run over 5 people, and there's a sidetrack where there's just one person, is it morally permissible to switch the train from the main track to the side track? Okay. And most people agree that it is, right? Whereas you would agree it isn't if there was one person on the main track and 5 people on the side track. Is it okay to switch from one, saving the one, to by as a side effect killing the 5? No, you can't do that, right? That's not something you're ever explicitly taught. But actually, one of the projects in our group, this is work that was done by Max Kleiman-Weiner and Sidney Levine, who have been in our group as postdocs, is actually building a quantitative model of this kind of inference that shows many different kinds of trade-offs. And it kind of explains what might be some kind of otherwise hard to describe intuitions. Like, for example, if there's one person on a track and then there's a sidetrack with another one person, is it permissible to switch from the main track to the sidetrack? Most of us would say no. That's kind of weird. It's like you're playing God, right? Who are you to decide which one person is going to die? But this and many other things, many other kinds of variants of the trolley problem, we can actually describe at the software level and capture people's graded judgments across dozens of these different variations very well. And then in Rebecca Sachs's work, she can tell us something about the parts of the brain that might be involved in this, and other people can tell us about parts of brain systems that do capture sort of notions of utility. So it's not crazy to imagine in the not too distant future that we can bring all those things together with the kind of techniques that Ed is talking about to actually understand how some of these kinds of computations might actually be, get into the brain through some combination of hard coding and cultural learning.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. I want to switch to a question that came in. There's a lot more we could talk about with that last question. We probably could have had a discussion around, but I want to get to a few other things that the audience is interested in. So question for you, Ed. you talked about the internal material, the diaper, the metaphor used with sort of the diaper material. Doesn't in vitro brain tissue expansion using your polymeric gels cause axonal stretching and injury? And I must say, I did think that the concept of this thing growing in the brain didn't sound like it was a good thing. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So first of all, we only do this on preserved tissues. This is never done on a living brain. Because as the questioner, I think, is alluding to, if you tried to expand a living brain, it wouldn't be living anymore.
Yeah.
But secondly, maybe let's spend a few seconds just talking about the length scales over which it works. So we're not moving cells apart from each other. We're actually moving all the molecules within the cell apart from each other. So it's like you draw a picture on a balloon and then you blow it up. It's the same picture, but all the ink molecules are spread apart. So it's like we're doing that, but in 3 dimensions rather than like a 2D image on the surface of a balloon. So is the axon being stretched? Well, maybe a more accurate way to think about it is the axon or any other tissue that we expand is made out of lots of molecules. And those molecules are being moved apart in an even fashion. So what does that let us do? Well, it lets us see where they are and to get that 3D map. On the other hand, those molecules aren't talking to each other anymore. It's no longer a living system, but it's a way of mapping out the molecular anatomy, if you will, of a cell or tissue.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. Another question for you from someone who's been watching. My wife has Alzheimer's. When and where are the human trials? And how do you get someone involved in being part of some of these trials or tests?
Sure. So Li Wei Sai at MIT is directing this project, although our group is a major collaborator helping. And there are some trials that are being orchestrated out of MIT. And there are also some trials that are being conducted by others as well. She and I started a company to do other trials named Cognito Therapeutics, and they're doing trials in the Boston area and exploring other things as well. There may be others at clinicaltrials.gov. One can look up clinical trials that are registered. One of our alumni, Annabelle Singer, now professor at Georgia Tech, is collaborating with people at Emory University. So I believe they have some trials that are ongoing. But one can look in these databases and find trials at, I think, many sites right now.
Great, thank you. A question for probably Josh, but really either of you. Given where AI is today and where it is going, is the Turing test obsolete?
So you mean the classic Turing test, right? So just everybody probably is familiar with this, but just to remind everyone, right? Alan Turing, in the same paper where he proposed the idea of intelligence as a kind of computation, suggested, well, how could we test if a machine that had been built somehow was intelligent? And he suggested something which was very intuitive, actually, though people have raised various critiques of it. But the idea is that you could basically put a person in one room and a machine in another room somehow, and then have a second person who's typing back and forth to the person in the machine. And in just a few minutes of back and forth conversation, the question is, could that human tell apart the real human from the machine, right? And if the machine could successfully fool the human judge, then we would have to say, Turing suggested, that the machine was intelligent. Okay. Not that it necessarily worked the same way as the human, but that was a behavioral standard. And I showed in my talk a very, very simple version of that for this kind of creative concept example generation, which I was saying we were able to pass now, that simple thing. So I think what you're asking maybe is in reference to the fact that there's been a lot of progress in many aspects of AI, but especially in what I guess you could call chatbots, right? So chatbots are the modern version of a Turing test, where there's a bot, a program that you interact with through a chat interface, and there's a lot of both economic and other interests in trying to have those be play human-like conversational roles. And in a sense, if we could build successful chatbots, then truly successful chatbots, then in some sense the Turing test would have been passed. But I think it's fair to say that while there has been a lot of progress in this, we're far from having a machine that you can have a conversation with in all the various ways that humans have conversations with each other. Like, for example, the kind of conversations we're having here right now, where people who maybe like Elizabeth, we've never met each other really, but we're having a conversation, we're learning things from each other, we're talking to each other. That kind of conversation is one that we don't have any ability in machines right now. The best AI chatbots, basically they stick to scripts, which could either be built in or they could be learned from a big data set of chats. But if the kinds of data sets that machine learning people are working with when they build chatbots are pretty limited. People might chat about movies or the weather. If you start to chat about a scientific idea or a philosophical question, or just anything that hasn't been discussed quite a lot in the data set that chatbot is trained on, then you quickly find yourself very convinced that you are not talking to another person. There are some of these systems that you can play with, and it's fun to both sort of follow the script and see where that takes you. And it does feel like there's the illusion of talking to another person, but then it's not that hard to kind of go off a standard conversational script and you see the limits. And this really reflects a more general theme in AI right now, right? Which is that problems that we can turn into basically pattern recognition problems, where we can generate a really big data set and build a really big pattern recognition architecture, often using the tools of neural networks. Those are problems that we're really making a lot of progress on, and they can be very useful in all these AI technologies, but they're not real intelligence. They don't understand what they're doing, and they don't, in some sense, understand what they're talking about. So the work that we're talking about is, say, how do we take the next step? How do we capture the kind of intelligence that is really about understanding? And that includes what's there before language and then how language builds on it. And I think it's going to be some years now, I would say decades, but maybe not that many decades, but at least 10 years and probably much more before we really have machine systems that you could talk to and really, talk to, trust, teach all the ways that we interact with each other, but in a machine form. I think it's not crazy to think that we might get there, but I actually think that's still a really interesting and long-term objective to be shooting for.
Yeah. We are coming to the end of the time we have. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask. One that's come in from the audience that connects to one that I had planned to ask anyway, having to do with COVID-19. There was a question that someone asked. Apparently, there's a member of our audience who has a loved one who has Alzheimer's, had the virus, and it appears to have accelerated their loved one's Alzheimer's. The question is there an impact on the brain that we know of at this point? And the answer may be we don't know. But before I ask Ed to sort of tackle that one as best he can, a follow-on question that I had planned to ask was really applications, ways that you all are doing, how you're allocating your energies and your research to looking at applications for COVID-19, either treatment or other elements of the fight that we're in. And so first, maybe I'll ask Ed if you have any insights into the impact of the virus on the brain, and then either both of you could talk to us about applications that are applicable to the virus.
Yeah, first of all, very sorry to hear of the questioner's loved ones' sufferings. Obviously, this is a critical time where those of us in science and engineering many of us trying to figure out how we can use our skills and abilities to solve this new and unprecedentedly fast impacting problem. There's a lot we don't know. In fact, we've just been chatting with our Alzheimer's collaborator, Li Wei Sai, who I mentioned earlier, about trying to study whether COVID-19 affects the brain. It's such a new thing that we actually have not done a lot of the underlying basic science as a community yet. And so one of the things that we're asking are, can any of our technologies, either the imaging tools or the optical tools and so forth, be used to study whether and how the brain changes, or whether other parts of the body change and then the brain changes as a secondary effect, which is also important. So my hope is that we can start to use some of these tools to accelerate that kind of investigation. Although again, it's such a new thing that it's just getting going. Just to quickly answer the second part of the question, a lot of people in the group, we're currently mostly working from home, but a small number of people haven't figured out how to apply their molecular skills, as our group is so molecularly focused, to designing new ways to try to diagnose or potentially treat COVID-19. So it's something that a lot of people in our group are actively thinking about. And we actually do have a few ideas about how we might work with other groups at MIT to develop, are there inhalable therapies that one might develop that would go into the lungs and help fight the virus? So this is all at the idea stage right now, although some of these we started to actually think about and design molecules that might help with this problem. Of course, we don't have biosafety level 3 facilities at MIT. So once we're done with the design, we're going to try to get it into collaborators' hands. People at BU, for example, who have a biosafety level 3 facility, and other places where they can actually do real tests of these kinds of inventions.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I would just say the best I can do is point to work of my close collaborator, Vikash Mansingha. So Vikash runs MIT's probabilistic computing group, and they're one of the leaders in developing these probabilistic programming languages that I talked about, right? And again, so many of us are affected in so many ways, and everybody's looking to see what they can do. So the people who've built probabilistic programming languages, one of the things that they've realized, and Vikash's group has been out in front leading some of these efforts, is that these tools that I talked about here that were developed to build, to give machines the ability that we see with humans to model the world and simulate the world, right? Like common sense, intuitive physics, right? Or understanding how people move through space, right? Those same kinds of tools that also allow us to model how people are able to learn from so little data, right? Like think about the example I showed of learning a new concept from one example and using a probabilistic program that models the causal processes that can simulate those and do inference with that. Those same kind of tools can be applied in many other areas of science where we have some intuitions about the causal process, some understanding, and relatively little data, and a lot of uncertainty, uncertainty everywhere in the data, but also in our causal understanding. So COVID is really a perfect example of that. And a number of people, including Vikash's group, have been using probabilistic programming tools to build new kinds of models that, again, take the best of what epidemiologists have been doing for a long time, but add in other kinds of tools. For example, Vikash's group is actually working with MIT's Quest for Intelligence, teams led by Nick Roy, to build tools that will be part of MIT's COVID response. This includes how the Institute reopens its research facilities, but especially as we start to bring students back to campus, and especially undergrads. There's going to be a lot of guesswork, but guesswork on the timeline for planning and how to respond if events come up, right? What do you do? Nobody knows the answer because we've never been here before. There's not like a big data set that we could mine for patterns and do machine learning on, right? So you're going to need tools for simulating, imagining, and trying out possibilities. Right now, the only tools we have are the ones inside our heads, right? And all of our decision makers are using those tools to make their best educated guess. But it's exciting that these tools, these probabilistic programming tools, are now being built, and they use, for example, models. You can integrate epidemiology ideas with models of how people move through space, how the virus particles might flow out when you talk or move through space. And you can put all of those things across different spatial and temporal scales, right? Much as Ed was talking about for the brain, and build models like that, that then human decision makers can use to make just more educated guesses. There's still going to be guesses, but I think it's exciting that these tools could be deployed in those ways. And I'm very proud that our colleagues are contributing those tools to MIT's effort to help us reopen in the safest way, especially when it comes to providing the educational experience for undergraduates on campus as soon as we can.
Great. Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Ed. We appreciated your sharing your work with the alumni and friends watching. Again, I want to repeat that all of these talks will be made available as soon as possible on the Tech Reunions website. Congratulations again to all of our reunion classes. We hope you enjoy the remainder of the Tech Reunions programming today. Up next is Explore MIT, several interactive sessions that highlight campus, career, and research programs. Thank you all, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.